Have you ever heard your grandfather tell horror stories, those that seem like just legends, but deep down hide something much darker? Imagine discovering that your own family hides a secret that should never be revealed. What if, upon hearing this story, something began to watch you in the darkness? Today, you will hear stories that your grandparents never wanted to tell, and in the end, you might regret hearing them. But be careful. After watching this video, it may be too late to forget. If you dare, keep watching. We continue. Real horror stories that grandparents never wanted to tell. Would you have the courage to listen? The cold night wind blew against the window as Daniel heard the old wall clock ticking the time. The hand approached midnight, and the room was lit only by the flickering flame of the fireplace. On the other side of the armchair, his grandfather, a man with deep eyes and wrinkles that seemed to tell decades of stories, stared at the fire with a distant expression. "Grandpa, is it true that every grandparent has a horror story that they never told anyone?" Daniel asked, half jokingly, half curiously. The silence that followed was heavier than he expected. Grandfather didn't laugh, didn't respond immediately. He just sighed, as if he had just opened a door that should never have been touched. "Some stories shouldn't be told, boy." "Deem," muttered the elderly man, without taking his eyes off the fire. Daniel felt a shiver run up his spine. The way your grandfather said it didn't seem like a joke. For a moment, the silence was broken only by the crackle of burning wood. "But then why do people always talk about them?" he insisted, trying to ease the tension. The old man closed his eyes, as if he was fighting memories he didn't want to relive. After a long sigh, he finally turned to his grandson and said something that Daniel would never forget. "Because some stories don't want to be forgotten." And that night, he began to tell something that should never be said out loud. Do you really want to hear it? The silence in the room seemed to last for a time that Daniel couldn't measure. His grandfather looked at him with a mixture of hesitation and something else. Fear. A real, almost palpable fear. "If I tell you this story, promise you will. Never repeat it to anyone." The elderly man's voice was low, almost a whisper. Daniel smirked, thinking it was all just a trick to scare him. But upon noticing the seriousness in his grandfather's eyes, his laughter died before it even began. "I promise." The old man nodded, but still looked reluctant. His gaze wandered around the room, as if making sure no one else was listening. The fire in the fireplace crackled, casting dark shadows across the walls. Then he leaned forward, approaching his grandson. "There are stories that shouldn't be told, because they attract attention." "Whose attention?" Daniel asked, feeling an icy shiver run down the back of his neck. The grandfather took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they seemed darker, as if they carried the weight of a secret that had been kept for too long. "Of those who still listen." The grandson swallowed hard. The room, once cozy, now seemed like a cold and strange place. For the first time that night, Daniel felt that perhaps he had made a mistake in pursuing that story, but now it was too late to turn back. The silence between Daniel and his grandfather was heavy. The crackling fire in the fireplace seemed more distant, as if the world around it had become smaller. The old man scratched his chin thoughtfully and then looked directly into his grandson's eyes. "What I'm going to tell you happened many years ago, and it started with a name that should never have been said." Daniel frowned. "A name? How could a simple name be so dangerous?" Before he could ask, the grandfather continued, "My father used to warn us when we were children. He said that there was a forbidden story, one that we shouldn't repeat out loud because if someone heard it, he would come." "He who?" Daniel asked, feeling a slight discomfort in the pit of his stomach. The grandfather looked away from the window, as if he feared something was lurking outside. His tone of voice became even lower, when he replied, "The one who walks among the shadows, the man without a face, the visitor from last night." Daniel felt a chill run up his spine. With each word, the atmosphere around him seemed to become thicker, colder. And what happens if someone says that name? Grandfather pressed his fingers against the arm of the chair, his knuckles turning white. Then he faced Daniel with absolute seriousness. He listens, and when he listens, he comes. The wind blew outside, strong enough to make the windows shake. Daniel flinched without realizing it. His grandfather didn't blink. He wasn't breathing deeply, just waited. He waited to see if his grandson would have the courage to ask for his name. Daniel felt his heart beat faster. The way his grandfather spoke, it didn't sound like a simple horror story. It felt real. But if no one can say the name, how can it be remembered? He asked, trying to understand. Grandpa let out a tired sigh. He seemed to be fighting something inside himself. His eyes, once so steady, seemed lost in memories that perhaps he would rather forget. Because some names don't need to be said to be remembered. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? The old man hesitated. He passed a trembling hand over his face, as if he were about to do something he had avoided all his life. Then he took a deep breath, and with his voice almost inaudible, he murmured, "The name has been forgotten." Silence took over the room. The wind outside stopped blowing. The fire in the fireplace seemed to die down, as if it were holding its own breath. Daniel felt an icy chill on the back of his neck. But if he was forgotten, how do you know about this story? The grandfather closed his eyes, as if that question was exactly what he feared. When he opened them again, Daniel saw something there that he had never seen before. Pure terror. "Because I've heard it, and once you hear it, it never lets you forget it." And then, far away, out there, in the middle of the silent night, something clicked in the dark. Daniel felt a shiver run through his body. The sound outside was low but clear, a sharp crack, as if something or someone had stepped on a branch in the middle of the night. He looked at his grandfather, waiting for some explanation, but the old man remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the window. His trembling hands gripped the arms of the chair tightly. "Grandpa, what was that?" Daniel's voice was weaker than he would have liked. Grandfather didn't respond right away. He seemed to hear. Wait. Outside, the night remained eerily silent. No sounds of crickets, no rustling of leaves in the wind, nothing, just suffocating stillness. Then, a new snap, this time closer. Daniel swallowed. His heart was beating so loudly that he could hear it in his own ears. Something inside him told him they weren't alone anymore. Grandpa finally moved. Slowly, he turned to Daniel and, in a faint voice, whispered, "Don't look out the window." But it was too late. Daniel was already looking. Daniel didn't want to look. Every fiber of his body told him to obey his grandfather. But curiosity was stronger. If there was something out there, he needed to see it. He turned slowly towards the window. The glass reflected the faint glow of the fireplace. But beyond that, there was only the darkness of night, twisted trees under, the pale moon. The forest seemed denser, more alive. For a moment, nothing, just the dark void between the trees. Then something moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible. A long shadow slipped between the trunks. Daniel squinted, trying to see better. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if his body already knew what his mind still refused to understand. The thing stopped. She stood there motionless, as if she knew she was being watched, and then Daniel saw it. Two small, dull lights staring back at him. They weren't normal eyes. They were deep, dull, as if they sucked in the little light around them. The boy felt a chill run up his spine. That wasn't human. That was when his grandfather grabbed his arm tightly and whispered desperately, "I said don't look." But it was already too late. Outside, the thing started moving towards the house. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. The thing was coming. Outside, heavy footsteps broke twigs and dry leaves. Slow, accurate, as if she knew she had already been seen and no longer needed to hide. The grandfather got up from the chair with difficulty and grabbed Daniel by the shoulders. His face was paler than ever. "Listen carefully, boy. Don't make any noise. Don't move. And most of all," he swallowed hard, "if you knock on the door, don't open it." Daniel felt his stomach sink. Knock on the door. The wind blew hard outside, making the trees lean. Shadows danced around the room. Daniel wanted to believe that it was all just a story, but the terror in his grandfather's eyes, that was real. The footsteps stopped. Now just silence. A tense silence. Then came the sound that chilled Daniel to the bone. OCD, OCD, OCD. Someone or something had knocked on the door. The sound still echoed throughout the room. 3 dry beats. You need it. As if the thing outside knew exactly where it was. Daniel held his breath. Grandpa too. OCD, OCD, OCD. The second knock was stronger. The wood of the door vibrated. Daniel felt a shiver run through his body. Your grandfather said not to open it, but what if it was just someone lost? What if it wasn't that? He looked at the old man, searching for some explanation, some alternative. But grandfather didn't move. His eyes were wide, fixed on the door, and his lips trembled in a barely audible whisper. He heard us. He knows we're here. The silence returned, but this time it felt wrong. As if the entire house was holding its breath along with them. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Then came the third knock. OCD, OCD, OCD. And outside, a hoarse voice whispered, I know they're there. Daniel felt his entire body paralyze. The voice outside was low, slurred, almost non-human. Grandpa grabbed his arm tightly, his eyes fixed on the door. His breathing was heavy, irregular. Don't answer, he whispered. Daniel swallowed. He didn't want to answer, but the voice seemed to know them. I know they're there, repeated the whisper from outside. Daniel closed his eyes tightly. Something inside him told him that if he looked through the lock, if he paid any attention to it, it would be too late. The wood of the door creaked. The thing outside was waiting, as if he wanted them to make a mistake. Then a terrible detail hit Daniel like a punch in the gut. The voice, she looked familiar. Daniel's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was impossible, but it sounded like his grandmother's voice. Grandpa, he whispered, feeling panic rising inside him. Is that her? Grandfather didn't respond right away. He just tightened his grip on Daniel's arm, as if that was the only thing that still kept him in the present. His eyes were glued to the door, shining with a terror the likes of which his grandson had never seen. That's not your grandmother. Oh, he murmured, his voice breaking. Outside, the voice continued. Daniel, open the door, my dear. Each word was said in the wrong way, as if the mouth that spoke was not used to that shape, that tone. It was like someone trying to imitate their grandmother, but failing. Daniel covered his ears, trying to block out that sound. His heart was beating so hard it hurt, and then the worst came. The voice laughed, low, hoarse, satisfied. I know you want to see. The laughter outside was not human. It was dry, dragging, like the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. Daniel felt a shiver take over his body. The thing knew. I knew he was listening, that he was feeling scared. Grandfather closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to remain calm. But Daniel could see his hands shaking. He had never seen his grandfather like this. Never. That's not real, Daniel muttered to himself, hoping that by saying it he could believe it, but the thing on the other side of the door heard it. Am I not real, Daniel? The voice mocked, soft, melancholic. But you remember me, don't you? Daniel swallowed. Yes, he remembered. The voice wasn't exactly your grandmother's, but it was very similar. "Open the door, my dear," insisted the voice. "Let me see how you've grown." Daniel felt his legs get weak. For a moment, for just a second, his body wanted to move. I wanted to open it, but his grandfather held his arm tighter. "Don't look, don't answer, don't move." His voice was a thread of despair. "That's not your grandmother. It never was." Daniel tried to hold on, but something was wrong. Very wrong. The room started to feel different. The air became heavier, as if something invisible was entering without permission. The fire in the fireplace flickered, as if a cold breeze was passing through, but all the windows were closed. Then came the final blow. "You feel that, don't you?" the voice whispered, now glued to the door. The doorknob began to turn slowly. Daniel wanted to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The thing was trying to get in. The doorknob turned, slowly, with a low, agonizing creak. Daniel felt his breath catch in his chest. That was there. The grandfather tightened his grip on his grandson's arm, forcing him to stay still. His eyes were wide, his forehead was sweaty. "Close your eyes." "Daniel," he whispered urgently, "no matter what happens, don't look at the door, but how not to look. How could I ignore that overwhelming presence that seemed to take over the house?" The wood of the door began to creak, as if something was pressing against it from the inside. But that didn't make sense. The thing was out there, or was it? Daniel felt the air becoming colder, as if an invisible shadow was seeping through the cracks in the door. The fire in the fireplace wavered, dwindling, as if something was sucking it away. The voice on the other end now sounded different, divided. "Daniel! Daniel!" she called, but now it was double, as if two mouths were speaking at the same time, one overlapping the other. A sweet tone, similar to her grandmother's. The other, low, serious, and distorted. "Don't you miss me?" The door shook. Something scratched the wood outside. Daniel closed his eyes tightly. He felt his body sweating coldly, his heart beating wildly. A part of him wanted to believe it was a dream, that he would wake up at any moment, but the scratches continued, long, slow, as if the thing liked doing that. Then came the sound that almost made Daniel open his eyes. OCD, 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 3 beats, but not at the door. This time they came from the window, and that wasn't possible. The window was on the 2nd floor. Daniel's heart almost stopped. The bedroom window was on the 2nd floor. There was no way anyone could be there. But the sound was real. OCD, 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 slow, necessary, waiting for a response. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to believe he was imagining things, that maybe it was just the wind throwing a branch against the glass. But deep down, he knew. I knew it wasn't that. His grandfather held his arm even tighter, as if he could stop him from reacting. But he himself was shaking. His eyes were fixed on the door, but his stiff body indicated that he had also heard the knocking. The fire in the fireplace suddenly went out. The house was plunged into suffocating darkness. The only light left came from the window, a pale, faint glow from the moon. And then Daniel saw it. A shadow moved outside. It was not an ordinary figure, like someone approaching or passing by. It was something bigger, something that didn't make sense. The shadow seemed to stretch, sliding across the glass, as if it were trying to get in, trying to find him. And then the worst happened. The voice sounded inside the room. "Daniel, you've seen me now. Why don't you let me in?" Daniel hadn't looked directly at the window. He didn't want to see, but the thing spoke as if he had already done it. The room was freezing, as if the air itself was being drained. The silence was heavy, filled only by the sound of scratching on the door and the rhythmic knocking on the window. Grandfather finally moved. "Close your eyes, boy," he whispered, desperate. Daniel obeyed, squeezing his eyes shut, hands covering his ears. But now it was too late. The thing knew he was there. I knew he was listening, and she wouldn't leave. Time seemed to have stopped. The room was dark, the fireplace was off, the cold was deep into Daniel's bones. The only thing that still made noise was the scratching on the door and the knocking on the window. But now there was something more, something worse, a whisper coming from inside the room. Low, almost imperceptible, like a thread of voice slipping through the air. It was not possible to understand the words, but the presence was there. Daniel squeezed his eyes even tighter, his ears ringing with terror. He felt his own heart pounding inside his chest, his trembling hands holding his legs. The grandfather beside him was breathing quickly, trying to remain calm. But Daniel felt it. He felt he was as terrified as he was. "This isn't real. This isn't real," Daniel repeated to himself, but his voice broke. The whisper continued, closer and closer, more and more inside, and then the mattress sank. Daniel felt the weight beside him. Something had sat on the bed. His body froze. He couldn't move. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't run. Grandfather held his arm tightly. "Don't move," he ordered in a low voice, but the thing knew he was there. The whisper turned to laughter, low, cold, and then an icy finger touched his hand. Daniel felt his skin burn in a strange way, as if the touch was something that shouldn't be there. The whisper was now in his ear. "You finally listened to me, Daniel. Now I can stay." Daniel wanted to scream, but his voice just wouldn't come out. And now, what would you do in his place? Would you open your eyes? Would you run? Or would I stay still, waiting for whatever was there to act first? Comment below. Do you believe stories like this? Have you ever experienced something inexplicable? I want to know your opinion. Daniel felt his breath holding, his muscles paralyzed by fear. The room was so silent that he could hear his own heart beating too fast, as if it was trying to escape from his chest. But the thing was there. The mattress was still sagging at his side. The weight was real. The icy touch still burned on his skin like a warning. She was close. And then the silence was broken. The door began to creak slowly. Daniel didn't know which was worse, the thing on the bed or what was trying to get in the door. He wanted to believe it was all just a nightmare, but there was something terribly real about it all. That's when the grandfather did something unexpected. He let go of Daniel's arm and whispered, "Run." The word was like a shock. But before Daniel could move, he felt something brush the back of his neck. Breathing, someone or something was after him. His entire body shivered. The air became heavy, difficult to breathe, as if invisible hands were squeezing your throat. He wanted to obey his grandfather. He wanted to run, but something was stopping him. The thing wanted him to look. I wanted to be seen, and then the worst came. Cold fingers slid up to his face and slowly forced his eyes open. Daniel tried to resist, but he couldn't. And for a second, just a second, he saw. What he saw was enough to make him want to forget, but he never made it again. His eyes were never the same again. The thing had stayed inside him, and now she watches from the inside. Since that night, Daniel has never been the same. In the following days, he tried to convince himself that it had all been a nightmare. But the signs were everywhere, small details that only he seemed to notice. The tea mirror fogged up on its own, as if someone was breathing too close. The mattress dipped slightly, even when I was alone in the room. And the worst part, he felt it. He felt eyes on him. It didn't matter if he was awake or asleep, whether it was at school, at home, or in the middle of the street. There was always something there, something he couldn't see, but knew was close. And then confirmation came. One night, he decided to face his fear. He sat in front of the mirror, alone, staring at his own reflection. But there was something strange. His eyes looked different, more funds, darker. As if something lurked inside, his heart sped up. The throat dried up. But he needed to be sure. He slowly raised his hand and ran his fingers over his face, and it was at that moment that he felt it. In the corner of his eye, right where the shadows hide, there was something cold, something that shouldn't be there. Fear took over. His entire body shivered, and then the reflection smiled, but he doesn't. Daniel jumped back, knocking over the chair, but the reflection remained there, standing still, smiling at him. And then he heard a whisper. I said, "I can stay now." The glass cracked. Small cracks formed in the mirror, as if something was trying to break out. From that day on, Daniel never looked in the mirror the same way again, because he knew something was watching him from the other side. Daniel started avoiding mirrors at any cost. He covered the bathroom window. Avoid reflective windows on the street. At school, he lowered his head whenever he passed any surface that could return his image. But he knew he couldn't run away forever. And that night, the inevitable happened. I was walking home when the streetlight flickered. A chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. He quickened his pace, feeling his heart hammering against his chest. The silence around them felt dense, as if the world was trapped in time. Then, without meaning to, he looked into the window of a closed store, and his blood ran cold. His reflection was there, but he didn't follow him. He continued to stand there, looking at Daniel, smiling. The eyes, deep and dark like an endless hole, were empty. And the moment he realized this, the reflection blinked. Daniel felt his body freeze. An invisible weight prevented him from running. Then slowly, the reflection raised its hand, but Daniel didn't move his. The glass started to crack. Tiny fissures spread like cobwebs. On the other side, something was trying to come out, and before Daniel could react, the reflection smiled. But this time, it wasn't his face. It was something else, something that wore his image but wasn't him. It was then that a hoarse voice whispered, coming from inside the glass, "It's time to change places." The crack expanded, a dry, splintering sound, and then the world went dark. Daniel woke up to a biting cold. But something was wrong, very wrong. The floor beneath him was not his bed, not even your room. The air felt thick, heavy, filled with crushing silence. His eyes slowly opened, and everything around him was inverted. The shadows were wrong, the shapes distorted. The world around him seemed like a corrupted version of reality. He tried to move, but his body was sluggish, as if something was draining his energy. It was then that he saw it. There in front of you sees the mirror, but it was no ordinary mirror. On the other side was himself, your reflection. But now, outside, smiling, despair took over. Daniel ran up to the glass, knocking hard. "Get me out of here!" But his reflection just laughed. The sound was muffled, almost a distant echo. Then the reflection tilted its head and whispered, "Now, I'm the one living your life." Outside, Daniel's reflection blinked and began to move away, leaving him trapped there alone on the other side. The surrounding light began to go out. The shadows spread like smoke, swallowing everything. And the last thing Daniel heard before darkness took over was a chilling whisper, "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The silence was absolute. Daniel tried to run, but the ground was liquid, dense like a molten mirror. Every step was a futile effort. He was trapped. That's when he heard it. Whispers, low, distorted, coming from all sides. He spun around, trying to see through the darkness around him, but there was nothing, just emptiness, until something breathed behind him. The air turned cold. His body froze. The whisper grew closer. "You took a long time." The voice was rough, hungry. Daniel didn't have the courage to turn around, but he felt it. Something big, something wrong, something that was there all along. Then, cold hands touched his shoulders. He shouted, but the sound was sucked into the void. The thing leaned over him, and for the first time, Daniel saw it. Faces, thousands of them, all twisted into expressions of despair, screaming without sound, and everyone, just like him, reflexes that never returned. The thing smiled, and everything went black. Everything was silent. The void swallowed Daniel, and the last thing he felt was the cold darkness enveloping his body. He tried to scream, but there was no more sound, there was no more air. Then he woke up, or at least he thought he woke up. He was back in his room, the family roof, the distant sound of cars passing on the street. Everything seemed normal, but something was wrong. He sat up slowly, his body feeling strange and heavy. The air had a different metallic smell. That's when he looked in the mirror, and his blood ran cold. His reflection was there, but he didn't. Follow him, he blinked. But not the reflection. The thing on the other side just stood there, watching him with blank eyes, as if it was waiting. And then, slowly, he smiled. But Daniel didn't smile. The smile in the mirror grew wider, beyond what was possible. It was then that he understood. He never came out the other side. The thing was already living its life. And now, it was too late. Daniel tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The feeling was of being trapped inside, oneself watching one's life happen without control. In the mirror, the thing wearing his face approached, tilting its head in a strange, non-human way. "It took you too long to realize," he whispered, his voice echoing inside Daniel's head. He wanted to scream, run, do something, but all I could do was watch. The reflection slowly raised its hand, fingers elongated, skin pale. Then, without breaking eye contact, he pressed the glass from the inside. The mirror cracked, a low, crunching sound like ice cracking underfoot. Daniel felt something rip inside his mind. Memories began to crumble. Your childhood, your first kiss, your name, your own face, everything was going out. "I am you now." The glass shattered, and the last thing Daniel saw was his own reflection coming out of the mirror. He smiled, turned around, and he went on to live his life, leaving Daniel on the other side, arrested forever. The emptiness around Daniel was overwhelming. There was no sound, no time, just endless, pitch black. He couldn't feel his body. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone. On the other side, its reflection, the thing, lived its life as if nothing had happened. His friends talked to him, his family hugged him, but no one noticed the difference. Daniel wanted to warn them. "I wanted to go back," but he couldn't. Then he began to realize he wasn't alone there. Shadows moved in the darkness. Pale eyes gleamed in the distance. Others were there, others that had also been replaced. There were many, countless. Some screamed in silence. Others just stared at him, their faces twisted in despair. Arrested, forgotten. Daniel wanted to run, escape this limbo. But where? There was no way out. It was then that he felt something different, a vibration, a distant echo, a whisper. "There is still a way." The shadows around him moved away. Something was approaching. Daniel didn't know what it was, but he realized this was his only chance, the last one. He needed to try. I needed to fight to get back before it was too late. The whisper continued, echoing in Daniel's mind like a distant hum, impossible to ignore. There is still a way. But what? Way? He was trapped, shrouded in shadows, surrounded by those who had been forgotten by the real world. Then he saw it. In the midst of the darkness, a trembling reflection appeared. Not a mirror, but a liquid, silvery surface, like a puddle floating. In the void, it pulsed, twitched as if it were alive. Daniel approached slowly. Something inside him whispered that this was his only chance. He looked inside and saw the real world. Your room. His reflection standing in front of the mirror. But something was wrong. The thing, the entity that stole his life, no longer smiled. She was standing still, her eyes fixed on the mirror, looking directly at Daniel. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was cold, empty. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The creature knew he was trying to come back. Without thinking, he stretched, his hand towards the liquid surface. His fingers trembled as he touched it. It was cold, but at the same time, it seemed to pull him. It was now or never. Taking a deep breath, he dove. The thing on the other side widened its eyes, realizing too late what was happening. Everything became a whirlwind of light and shadows. The void roared around him. Something tried to hold him back. Invisible hands tugged at his feet, but Daniel forced his mind to fight. He had to go back, and then, in a second that seemed eternal, he opened his eyes. It was back, standing in front of the mirror in your room. Air filled his lungs again. He could feel his body, the sweat running down his forehead, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked at the mirror. The reflection was there. Normal. Or at least, it seemed normal. Daniel took a step back, panting. Everything seemed right, but a doubt crept into his mind. What if he hadn't been the one to come back? "Are you sure it's you who's there now?" The lamp blinked and the video went black. "Did you blink your eyes in front of the mirror today? Are you sure it was you who came back?" Stories like this are not just tales. They may be closer to reality than we imagine. What would happen if one day you realized that something about you changed, but no one else noticed? Think carefully before turning off the lights tonight. And if you want to continue exploring dark mysteries like this, I challenge you to watch the next video. But be careful, some stories are not meant to be heard alone. Comment here. Have you ever felt like something was watching you through the mirror? Subscribe to the channel, because there are stories that haven't been told yet, and maybe you need to hear them before it's too late.